Hello, my dear viewers. I wish you pleasant viewing and a wonderful day. I also look forward to your feedback in the comments. My name is Ariana, and I used to believe that loyalty meant something, that if you worked hard, brought in results, and supported your colleagues, you'd be safe, valued, even indispensable. I believed that if you were the kind of person who stayed late, took on the hard projects, and quietly made others shine, the universe would keep you protected. It sounds naive now, I know that. But back then, I wore that belief like armor. That belief shattered 3 days before the biggest moment of my career, the awards ceremony that was supposed to be my coronation. I had just finalized a $500 million international tech acquisition, a historic moment for the company. It had taken 18 months of negotiations, grueling travel schedules, and countless nights where I fell asleep with spreadsheets glowing on my laptop screen. My fingerprints were on every clause, every loophole closed, every hidden liability rooted out. This deal wasn't just a win, it was a masterpiece. Everyone at the firm was buzzing. Emails flooded in with subject lines like, "You did it," and "Unbelievable work, Ariana." The executive board released a memo calling it a paradigm-shifting moment. My boss, Charles, bought me a bottle of aged scotch with a handwritten note. To the architect of our legacy. I should have felt euphoric. Instead, I felt tired, but in the best way. That deep, bone-level exhaustion that comes from knowing you gave something everything you had. That night, I stayed late at the office, running last-minute numbers for the presentation we were preparing for investors. It was nearly 9 p.m. when I realized I had left my water bottle in conference room Theta. I padded down the hallway, heels clicking on the polished floor, expecting silence. But the light was on inside the room. And then I heard voices. I stopped, startled. The door was almost fully closed, but a small gap let the sound escape clearly. I knew I shouldn't eavesdrop, but the second I heard my name, I forgot how to move. "We can't afford the optics of firing her before the ceremony," Charles said. His voice was calm, businesslike, the way he sounded during budget reviews. "Let her have her little moment, then we'll make the announcement." I blinked. The word firing hung in the air like smoke. Lena's voice followed, clipped and precise. "Exactly. We give her the award, smile for the cameras, then have HR send the paperwork by Monday. Immediate termination. NDA enforcement. Full package. We keep it clean." Clean. They were planning to erase me, neatly, efficiently. And then, the voice I knew best joined in. "She'll be fine. Ariana always lands on her feet. Honestly, this deal was already in motion. She just pushed it over the finish line." Lola. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Lola, who I had taken under my wing 3 years ago when she was drowning in post-grad anxiety. Lola, who I vouched for when no one else would. Who I stayed up with, night after night, rehearsing pitches and building her confidence. She used to call me her work sister. My ears started ringing. The rest of their conversation blurred into a stream of muffled noise. I was shaking, standing frozen outside that door, my hand clenched around the strap of my laptop bag. I backed away, step by step, until I reached the elevator. The hallway felt colder than usual, like the air conditioning had been turned up just to spite me. I pressed the button with numb fingers. The doors opened. And there she was. Lola, fixing her lipstick in the mirrored wall, her face soft with contentment. She caught my eye, smiled, and said, "Big week, huh? You must be buzzing." I managed a nod. My lips twitched into a facsimile of a smile. When I got home, I didn't cry. I sat on the floor of my living room, still in my heels, the glow of the city pressing in through the windows. The silence was so complete it was deafening. I replayed every conversation I'd ever had with Lola, every late night, every laugh, every secret shared in confidence. And now, she was part of the execution team. I didn't sleep that night. My mind spun in loops, cataloging every betrayal, every moment I should have seen it coming. But I hadn't, because I trusted them. That was my mistake. The next 2 days, I played the role, I smiled during meetings. I reviewed timelines. I congratulated interns on their progress. No one noticed the change. No one noticed the silence under my cheer. But something inside me had shifted. I didn't feel anger, not exactly. I felt something colder, something cleaner, like the smooth surface of ice just before it cracks, the kind of calm that comes when you've already decided. I wasn't going to fight. I wasn't going to cry or argue or beg. I was going to smile through the ceremony, let them have their illusion, let them feel clever. Then I would walk out. And when I did, they wouldn't even realize what they'd lost. But they would. Because what none of us knew, not yet, was that when I stepped out of that ceremony, with their applause still ringing in my ears, the first domino had already fallen. And within 24 hours, the system we built together would begin to collapse. And the $500 million, that would vanish without a trace. The morning after the awards ceremony, the office was soaked in that sterile, uncomfortable quiet that feels less like peace and more like a collective hush before a thunderclap. You know that quiet. When people know something's wrong but pretend not to. When even the tapping of keys sounds intrusive. I arrived at 7:49 a.m., nearly an hour earlier than most. It had always been my habit. I liked those early moments when the office lights were still dim and the city outside hadn't yet fully woken up. I liked having space to think, to strategize, to breathe. Today, it was different. I wasn't here to win anything. I wasn't even here to work. I was here to watch, to witness, to see what they'd do next, after stealing my moment, planning my downfall, and handing my future over to someone who hadn't earned it. I walked past the glass boardroom, the same room where, just days earlier, I'd overheard them planning to cut me loose. The memory still burned in the back of my throat. I could almost hear Lola's laugh, that soft, sugary one she used when she was pretending to be harmless. My desk was untouched, not a single note or sticky or meaningless congratulation. But I noticed something else. Glances. Sideways ones from people I used to eat lunch with. Whispered words as I passed. Silences that stretched too long. At exactly 10:13 a.m., my phone vibrated against the desk. A private international number. I picked it up instinctively, unsure why my heart was suddenly hammering. "Ariana!" came the voice. Miriam Holt, CEO of Xenix Corp. Her voice was sharp, efficient, but there was a warmth underneath that made my spine straighten. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. "Not at all." "We're ready to move forward," she said. "My board just signed off on the second phase of our collaboration. But we have a condition, a very firm one." I braced myself. Conditions usually meant delays, budget cuts, concessions. "We want you to lead it, exclusively." I was so stunned I didn't say anything. "Sorry?" I said, because it was the only word that came. "You, not your team, not your supervisor, you. We're only interested in continuing this integration if you're heading the strategy." There was a silence. A pregnant one. "It's about trust," she continued. "And clarity. Your work made the difference. We signed because of you, and if you're not the one steering this, we walk." I should have felt vindicated. I should have smiled. But all I felt was this jagged, broken heat crawling up my neck. It was like someone had just handed me proof of my own worth, right after everyone else had declared me worthless. "I'll relay the message," I managed. "Please do," Miriam said. "And Ariana?" "Yes." "They may not value what you bring, but we do. If anything changes, if they don't appreciate what they have, call me." The line went dead. I sat there a full 2 minutes staring at the screen. Then I stood, walked straight to the executive wing, and knocked on the frosted glass door of the leadership suite. Charles, Lena, and Theo were inside. A strategy meeting, supposedly. They didn't invite me. Of course they didn't. Charles waved me in without standing. Lena didn't even look up from her tablet. "I just got off the phone with Miriam Holt," I began, keeping my tone steady. That got their attention. "She's approved Phase 2 of the Xenix Corp integration, but with one condition." I met each of their eyes. "She wants me to lead it, solely, That sentence should have been a victory banner, a crowning moment. Instead, Charles's brow furrowed, like I'd handed him a riddle. Lena's expression didn't change at all, just a quick flick of her stylus across the screen. That's unexpected, Charles muttered after a beat too long. We'll need to evaluate the implications, Lena added, her voice so measured it might have been AI generated. Not a smile, not a nod, not even a perfunctory, well done. Nothing, just silence. I stood in the center of the room, watching three people who absolutely knew, that I had just closed the most important deal in our company's history, and they acted like it was a complication. And suddenly, I understood. It wasn't that they didn't see my value. It was that my value had become a threat. I was no longer the obedient star player. I was an outlier, a rogue factor they couldn't control. That scared them. Because people like Charles and Lena, they didn't want brilliance. They wanted predictability, loyalty, quiet compliance. And I wasn't quiet anymore. Still, some ridiculous part of me hoped this would change things, that they would come to their senses, realize how deeply embedded I was in the foundation of our success. But I wasn't naive enough to ignore the truth staring me in the face. To them, my achievements weren't a triumph. They were an inconvenience. And the next move they made would prove just how far they'd go to erase the threat they thought I posed. I think there's a moment in every betrayal story where something inside you simply unhooks. For me, that moment came not with a scream or a breakdown, but with the mechanical hum of the office elevator as I rode it up alone, 3 days after the award ceremony. I stood under the fluorescent lights, holding a worn, clunky laptop pressed to my chest like a secret. It had a loose hinge and took nearly 4 minutes to boot up, but it was unmonitored, unregistered, and untouched by corporate policy. It was freedom. I hadn't opened this laptop since I moved into my current role. Back then, I thought bringing personal devices into work was unnecessary, idealistic even. That was when I still believed loyalty would protect me. Now I knew better. The first time I powered it on, the machine made a low growling sound, like it remembered every late night we'd spent together in grad school. I had once built trading simulators on this thing. Now I was building something far more dangerous. I called it Aegis. The name came to me almost immediately. It meant shield, protection. A name meant for the quiet, brutal work of defense. And that was exactly what I needed. I wasn't building a system to compete with the company's architecture. I was building a parallel universe, one where I controlled the terms. Every module was designed from scratch, each function encrypted with keys stored only on an external drive I wore around my neck like jewelry. Aegis was sleek, scalable, and most importantly, legally clean. Not a single line of code borrowed from the original framework. No shared libraries. No assets developed on company time or machines. I documented everything. Every build note, every test run, every timestamp. If anyone ever tried to accuse me of theft, I'd have an airtight wall of proof standing between them and any claim they made. But I didn't stop there. While Aegis took shape, I turned my attention to something else. Lola. It started with little things. Missing sections from reports. Strategy slides that looked familiar. Notes I'd made on a whiteboard erased before I could present them, only to resurface in her one-on-one meetings with senior leadership. At first, I wanted to believe it was coincidence, a shared vision, parallel thinking. But then I checked the system logs. She had accessed my project folders 5 times in 1 week, always late at night, always remotely. The files had subtle changes, titles rewritten, conclusions softened, references removed. And each time, they showed up later in presentations bearing her name. She was stealing from me, openly, confidently, like she believed no one would ever question her. I started recording everything. Every time she downloaded a document I hadn't shared, I saved the log. Every time she edited my original files and renamed them, I created duplicates and timestamped the changes. I installed undetectable software that tracked user activity on shared drives. I filmed my own presentations, took screenshots of file trees, and backed up everything to a private cloud account. I stopped confronting. I stopped warning. I simply documented. Let her lie. Let her fake and plagiarize and pretend. I was building something she couldn't touch. Aegis became my obsession. I coded in the early mornings before the office filled with noise, and again late at night after everyone had gone home. My fingers ached, my eyes burned, but I didn't care. I was tired in a way that caffeine couldn't fix, tired of giving everything and watching others take the credit. Every new feature of Aegis was personal. It didn't just manage client portfolios, it learned from them. It didn't just track performance, it predicted churn before it happened. I wove every insight I'd ever been denied credit for into its DNA. Slowly, Aegis became more than a project. It became proof. Proof that I didn't need them. Proof that I was the foundation, not the brick. But as the system grew, so did the distance between me and the people around me. I stopped attending after-work drinks. I skipped meetings that didn't require my input. I avoided Lola like she was radioactive. And I noticed something else. People started noticing me less. Which was perfect, because they didn't need to see me. They just needed to keep underestimating me. I remember one specific night when the weight of it all caught up with me. I stayed at the office past 11 p.m., working out a bug in Aegis's learning model. The building was empty, eerily quiet, just the occasional hum of the AC and the city lights blinking far below the window. I stood and looked around the office, the award plaques, the corporate branding, the sterile potted plants that always smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, and I felt something strange. Not anger, not grief, liberation. For the first time in my life, I wasn't building someone else's dream. I wasn't playing the role of the dependable workhorse, the silent contributor, the fixer they could discard when the crisis passed. I was building mine. They hadn't fired me yet, but I was already gone. And soon, they'd understand what it means to lose the one person they thought they could live without. The invitation came like an afterthought, a calendar ping on my screen at 7:12 a.m. Strategic Roundtable, Phase 2. Integration. No greeting, no details. Just the meeting title and a list of attendees. I recognized most of the names. Charles, of course. Lena. Theo. A few board observers. A pair of consultants whose names I'd never seen before. And at the bottom, almost as if it were an error, Ariana Kalin. Optional attendee. Optional. I stared at that word for longer than I'd care to admit. It wasn't just a slight. It was a signal. A soft, silent message that I wasn't essential anymore. I had gone from architect to accessory in less than 2 weeks. I arrived early anyway. Old habit. Hopeful delusion. The room was one of the bigger ones. Glass walls, sleek wood table, and that new, sterile diffuser scent that was supposed to smell like cedar and success, but mostly smelled like money laundering and citrus. I chose a seat near the center, beside a stack of briefing packets I had helped create. My name wasn't on any of them. By 9 a.m., the room was full. Lena strolled in with her usual click-click-click of stilettos and the controlled chaos of someone who thrived on other people's silence. Charles entered last, flanked by 2 men I'd never seen before. They wore matching navy suits, perfect teeth, and the kind of smug energy that floated in ahead of their words. "Let's jump in," Charles said, without preamble. He didn't look at me. The projector screen blinked to life, displaying a title I knew by heart. Xenix Corp Phase 2. Strategic Consolidation Framework. I'd written the original draft of that framework 2 months ago. I'd worked on it over a weekend in March, surrounded by cold coffee cups and back-to-back calls with Xenix's European team across 5 time zones. I knew every variable, every pain point, every workaround. But as the meeting began, it was like I didn't exist. Theo spoke first, reading from bullet points with the energy of a man who had memorized just enough to sound intelligent, but not enough to explain anything if questioned. The consultants chimed in next, using phrases like market-facing integration narrative and reputation asset leverage, which meant nothing and yet somehow seemed to impress the board observers. At one point, one of them described our entire onboarding system as refreshingly intuitive, considering its legacy DNA. Legacy DNA. That was code for not their work, but we'll pretend it is. I sat still, hands folded, heart pounding louder than the ventilation system above us. I waited for a moment. A pause, a nod, anything, to signal that it was my turn. That someone in the room remembered who had built the infrastructure they were now so comfortably discussing. Instead, Charles shifted in his seat and asked Lena, "Do we have alignment on the Phase 3 transition ownership?" Lena didn't miss a beat. "Yes. Lola will be coordinating the cross-functional team assignments, starting with client comms and data migration." And just like that, Lola had been handed the entire integration rollout. No process, no debate, no acknowledgement that I had done every inch of foundational work leading to that point. My breath caught. "Excuse me," I said softly. "I just want to clarify. Phase 2, rollout depends on client-side behavior models we haven't implemented yet. The system they're presenting here lacks the predictive engine that we—" Charles raised a hand without looking at me. "Let's not get into the weeds, Ariana." I froze. "The weeds?" "That's implementation detail," he continued. "We're here to talk big picture, strategic vision." Lola leaned forward, tone syrupy smooth. "Ariana's been absolutely essential on the technical front," she said, smiling at me like we were best friends. "Really, she's our secret weapon. But at this stage, it's about cohesion and tone. You know how clients are? They respond to confidence, not code." Everyone nodded. No one looked at me. My jaw clenched. "Without the code, there is no confidence," I said, quieter this time. "There's no system to trust if it fails." "But it won't fail," said one of the consultants, chuckling. "The heavy lifting's already done, right? We're just dressing it up now." They laughed. Actually laughed. I felt something in me crack. Not shatter, just fracture with that dull, splintering sound you feel more than hear. I looked around the table. My hands, folded so tightly the knuckles were white. The files, filled with my diagrams, now stripped of my fingerprints. My seat, still warm, still present, but already forgotten. That's when I saw it. I wasn't being sidelined. I was being erased. And the worst part? They were doing it politely, efficiently, smiling while they did it, complimenting my execution and value, while quietly writing me out of the story. Lola glanced at me again, that same too sweet expression masking the edge beneath it, a predator's courtesy. She had waited her turn, watched me build the kingdom, then simply smiled her way into the throne room while they handed her the crown. And I had let them. All this time, I thought the work would speak for itself. It doesn't. Work only matters when the right voice says it out loud. Mine had been muted. I was no longer at the center of the game. I was a shadow in the corner, a ghost seated at the table where I used to lead. But that realization didn't crush me. It clarified me. Because you can't erase someone who's already building somewhere else. They didn't know about Aegis. They didn't know what I was preparing. And now, I wouldn't just walk away. I would let them keep talking, while I finished the system that would make every word of theirs obsolete. The meeting dissolved without so much as a closing statement. The consultants chuckled among themselves as they packed up, one of them even saying something about dinner reservations at some overpriced fusion place downtown. Lena glanced at her watch and swept out of the room like a gust of branded perfume. Charles didn't acknowledge me. He just muttered something to Lola and followed the group, the door hissing shut behind them. I sat there, alone at the conference table, surrounded by the echo of a room where power had passed me by. I hadn't spoken in the last 30 minutes, not since being told, so diplomatically, that my insight was too technical for the strategic layer, as if the system they were building their careers on hadn't poured from my fingertips. I packed up slowly, deliberately, afraid that if I moved too quickly, the rage and shame might spill over. I kept my face calm, but inside, I felt raw and flayed, like skin pulled tight over glass. There was only one thing that could bring me back down to earth: Liam. He and I had started at the company the same year. We'd bonded over shared deadlines and mutual disdain for the coffee in the executive kitchen. He was sharp, dry-humored, and always knew when to let silence speak louder than outrage. Every Thursday for the past 3 years, we had kept the same ritual: 11:15 coffee, rain or shine, victory or defeat, no agenda, no work talk if we didn't want it. Just two people stealing 30 minutes of honesty in a building built on performance. Even during the busiest weeks, even when deadlines loomed, we found a way. Sometimes it was a 5-minute chat near the elevators. Sometimes it was a shared bench at the food truck outside. It had become the anchor in my week, a small promise that not everything here was transactional. So at 10:57, I texted him like I always did, my fingers hesitating a little longer than usual. "You still good for coffee?" I waited, watched the 3 little dots flash for a second and disappear. By 11:10, I was already downstairs, standing under the awning near our usual spot. The sky was overcast, that soft gray light that makes everything feel like a memory in progress. I checked my phone again. Still no reply. He was never late, not once. I told myself he was caught up in something: a last-minute meeting, a client call. Maybe he forgot to charge his phone. But the truth, the real truth, had already begun to bloom in my chest, cold and certain. He wasn't coming. I stood there in the misting air, arms folded tightly around myself, pretending I wasn't checking the door every time it opened, pretending I didn't care. At 11:22, my phone buzzed. A message from Liam, just one line: "I can't take sides, Ari. I'm sorry." That was it. I stared at the screen, heart thudding in that terrible slow way it does when you realize something final has happened. Like when someone closes a door and you know, instinctively, it won't open again. No context, no apology beyond the coward's classic, "I'm sorry." No acknowledgement that what was happening wasn't a matter of sides, it was a matter of right and wrong. He had chosen safety, he had chosen silence, just like everyone else. I should have expected it, should have prepared myself. But betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. The hardest ones are from people who once held space for your voice, who once knew you in your most unguarded moments, and then turn away when you need them most. Liam knew what was happening. He had sat beside me through the late nights and the urgent fire drills that turned into hours of unpaid work. He had once told me, "If they ever try to edge you out, I'll raise hell." But now, he wouldn't even raise his eyes to meet mine. I felt something shift inside me, not shatter, not explode. It was quieter than that, more final, like the sound of a lock clicking shut on a room I didn't realize I'd still been living in. People think betrayal is a blade, but sometimes it's an absence, a silence where loyalty should have spoken. I turned from the cafe and walked slowly back toward the building. The air felt colder now, like even the atmosphere understood what I'd just lost. As I stepped through the glass doors, I passed a cluster of interns laughing about something in the break room. One of them looked up and gave me a polite nod. I nodded back, even though I was barely holding myself together. Upstairs, I passed Liam's office. His door was closed. The overhead light was off. Still, I stood there for a moment, not knocking, just knowing. The last person I had trusted had closed the door on me. I wasn't just professionally isolated now, I was personally erased. And yet, strangely, that realization didn't break me. It hardened me, because finally, I had nothing left to lose. No illusions, no backup, no soft landing. Just me, and the system I was building in silence. They had stolen my credit, hijacked my future, and now they were carving my name out of relationships I had trusted for years. Let them. Let them laugh and pretend, because I wasn't here to fight for a seat anymore. I was here to flip the table. It arrived on a Wednesday. There was no courier, no confidential stamp, no signature required. Just a plain envelope slipped into my personal mailbox, nestled between a real estate flyer and a water bill I'd been meaning to pay for 2 days. I didn't think twice when I picked it up. The envelope was thin, standard. My name typed cleanly on the front. Not my work address. Not even the apartment office drop. My home mailbox. My sanctuary. That was the first violation. Inside was a single page, crisp, clinical, and so blandly formatted that it almost passed for junk mail. Until I saw the letterhead. Executive Personnel Directive. Internal use only. My heartbeat skidded. I unfolded the page, hands suddenly clammy. Subject: Termination. Ariana Kalin, effective. Date: September 19th. Filed by Human Capital, Strategic Realignment. Authorized by L. Ventris, Director, Strategic Partnerships. Status: Finalized. I read it once, then twice. The words didn't change. The date didn't shift. The signature at the bottom didn't disappear. September 19th. 3 days before the awards ceremony. I stared at the date until the numbers felt like a countdown to a trap I didn't know I had already walked into. It was all there in ink and policy. I had been dismissed before they applauded me on stage, before Lola placed a glass plaque in my hand and called me a visionary, before the cameras flashed and Charles clapped me on the back like a proud uncle. They had celebrated me after they decided to erase me. My ears buzzed. For a moment, I couldn't hear the city noise outside, the ticking kitchen clock, even my own breath. They hadn't just fired me. They had performed it. I slumped into the nearest chair, the paper trembling slightly in my fingers. The weight of the realization didn't hit me like a punch. It settled like a stone in my chest. Heavy, cold, permanent. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't office politics. This was premeditated. Lola had signed my termination. Personally. Her name in that familiar curved signature at the bottom of the page. The same Lola who had smiled, posed, toasted me with champagne. Who had looked me in the eye, voice syrup sweet, and said, "You earned this, Ariana. You deserve every bit of it." That wasn't just cruelty. That was theater. A show for the board, the staff, the shareholders. One last performance to make sure no one questioned what came next. After all, if I had just received an award, surely I had departed willingly, right? No one would suspect the truth. No one would see the blade behind the bow. I should have cried. I should have screamed, or thrown something, or called someone, anyone. But I didn't. Because I was done giving them more than they were worth. Instead, I folded the document neatly, almost reverently, and slid it into the drawer beneath my old laptop, the same one humming quietly beside me. The one no one at the company knew existed. The one housing the real project that would make all their orchestrated betrayal meaningless. Aegis. The word alone steadied me. The system I had designed, encrypted, tested. Mine from line one. Legal. Isolated. Quietly growing in power with every day they ignored me. They thought they had taken everything, but they hadn't touched the one thing they couldn't steal. My vision, my work, my future. They had silenced my voice in the boardroom, but I had taught myself a different language, one of code, design, leverage. And in that language, I wasn't just still speaking, I was screaming. As I powered up Aegis, the screen came alive with familiar light. I ran my fingers across the keyboard, not with sadness, but with calm, surgical purpose. A series of logs blinked online, systems clean, backups confirmed, remote server access verified. They had made a critical mistake. They thought I would be too shocked to act, but I wasn't frozen. I was ready. That document wasn't a death sentence. It was a declaration of war. They had played their first move with a smile and a handshake. Now it was my turn. And I wasn't playing nice anymore. Some nights change you. They don't start with thunder or a knock on the door. They start with silence. The kind of silence that feels like the edge of something, not an ending, but a ledge. Something you have to step off if you ever want to touch the ground again. That's where I was the night I reopened the folder. Not digital, not on a drive. A real folder, paper, ink, handwriting. The kind you keep when you're not sure why you're keeping it. Just that some part of you knows it might matter one day. On the tab, written in block letters, was a single phrase. Outside threads. It was my private archive of talent, names and firms and forgotten pitches. People I had encountered over the years who didn't fit into my company's pristine, carefully filtered mold. Visionaries they dismissed as raw. Innovators they labeled not scalable. Solutions they'd laughed out of the boardroom because they didn't come dressed in the right jargon or backed by the right VCs. People like Jasper Ewan. 3 years ago, Jasper had walked into our office with a prototype so elegant it almost hurt to look at. A self-healing architecture that could adapt in real time to systemic breaches without downtime. I remember how still he was when the board laughed, calling it a solution in search of a problem. I remember the look on his face, not angry, not surprised, just used to it. I had watched that pitch from the back of the room, junior enough not to speak, senior enough to understand what we were throwing away. I hadn't forgotten. And now, I needed people who knew what it meant to be underestimated. I sent a message. Plain. Honest. No corporate gloss. Building something sovereign, clean, scalable. I've written the framework, the logic, the protection stack. I need co-dev support, discrete infrastructure, and a team who gets the value of starting from scratch. Interested? I expected a delay. I got a reply before sunrise. We've been expecting this email for years. Let's talk. The call was set within 24 hours. I dressed like I used to before I stopped pretending. No blazer, no performative heels, no lipstick armor, just a black t-shirt, loose jeans, and the truth. Jasper appeared on screen first. He looked exactly the same, calm, precise, like a man who had stopped caring about impressing anyone and started focusing on what actually mattered. Next to him was Erin Cho, Reeve Systems Integrity Architect. I had followed her work for years. Neural layer segmentation, autonomous data lineage. She had written papers my old boss used in keynotes without ever citing her name. I greeted them, then shared my screen. I walked them through Aegis, not all of it, just enough. Enough to show the integrity of the system, its self-validating loop, the modular growth nodes, the built-in privacy matrix. I spoke the language I'd taught myself in silence, without filter, without apology. When I finished, there was a pause. But it wasn't the kind I was used to, the cold executive kind that followed judgment. This one was warm, full. Jasper leaned back, folded his arms, and simply said, "That's real. No slide deck, no fluff. Just acknowledgement." Erin nodded once, then leaned in. "What do you need?" I stared at her, my throat catching unexpectedly. That question, it undid me. Not, "What's your track record?" Not, "What's your funding?" Not, "Why you?" Just, "What do you need?" It had been years since anyone asked me that without a condition attached. Years since someone looked at what I built and didn't ask me to shrink it to fit inside their limited imagination. I swallowed hard and laid it out. Co-development space, off-grid. Dedicated latency-optimized infrastructure for expansion testing. Legal shielding. Secure sandboxing with mirror controls. They listened. They asked smart questions. They didn't challenge my authority over my own system. They built on it. We spoke for hours. By the end of that call, I had more than allies. I had collaborators. Jasper offered access to their private dev environment, encrypted, partitioned, invisible to any corporate trace. Erin said she'd assigned 2 engineers to help scale Aegis's security feedback loop. I didn't ask for ownership terms, because they didn't want any. "This is yours," Erin said. "We're just helping build the scaffolding." I sat there in silence for a beat, my heart beating faster than it had in weeks. Not from fear, from recognition. This was what it felt like to be seen, to be chosen not for politeness, not for performance, but for truth, for the strength of an idea, for the clarity of architecture, for talent I had stopped trying to package neatly. For once, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything. They saw it already. That night, long after the call ended, I stood at the window of my apartment and watched the lights of the city blink like signals from a different universe. I wasn't on the outside anymore. I was building something outside their walls, beyond their reach. Not revenge, not rage. A platform, a future, mine. There are moments in life when your past self reaches out and saves you. For me, that moment came with the soft click of my apartment drawer sliding open. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I'd just come home from another quiet work session with the Reeve Systems team and had collapsed into one of those restless, half-anxious, half-empowered hazes that linger after adrenaline wears off. Something in me, muscle memory or instinct, reached for the stack of old documents I hadn't touched in years. It was there, tucked between a faded lease agreement and an expired passport, my original employment contract. Back when I joined the company, I wasn't anyone's threat. I was young, ambitious, eager to prove myself. They gave me a cubicle and a project no one cared about, and I turned it into the core of what would later become the company's flagship product. But even back then, something inside me hesitated. Maybe it was the way they handed me NDAs like candy, or how Charles once smiled at me and said, "Of course, we'll give you credit, unless it makes the deal harder." A joke, probably, but it stuck. So I'd taken the contract to someone I trusted, an old mentor from grad school who now worked as a legal advisor for a small firm specializing in tech IP. And with their help, I had added a clause. Just one. So small, so simple. It didn't scream, didn't wave red flags. It didn't even raise eyebrows when HR filed it. The operational license for proprietary system infrastructure, including algorithmic logic, client engagement automation, and system integrity protocols, remains contingent upon the continued employment and active participation of the original lead system architect, hereafter LSA. In the event of termination without renegotiated consent, license validity and operational authority become null and void. I read that line now with shaking hands. Because on the day of the award ceremony, when they smiled at me, toasted me, raised glasses, and offered shallow applause, my name had already been removed from the system's future. But the system hadn't been removed from me. That clause wasn't a booby trap, it was a lock. One that only I could open. They had assumed that firing me was simple, that my contributions were finished the moment I left my badge on the desk, that I had been a tool, not a key. But the system didn't recognize Lola, or Charles, or the board. It recognized me. Not because I said so, but because I had built it that way. Quietly, thoroughly, without fanfare. They thought they'd inherited the architecture. They hadn't. They had inherited a dependency, and they didn't even know it. I sat down on the floor, the contract in my lap, and felt a slow, strange emotion rise in me. It wasn't joy or vindication. It was peace, not because I had power, but because I had control. They had planned my exit with surgical precision, but I had planned my presence with permanence. I opened my laptop, heart pounding. I logged into the legacy admin portal, the one no one had thought to revoke access to, probably assuming it would expire on its own. It didn't. I was still there, still listed as primary system custodian. I clicked on the deep code logs. It was like walking through a house I'd built from scratch, now redecorated in someone else's taste. But beneath the surface, the bones were still mine. And in those bones, I found the quiet pulse of the clause I had embedded like a heartbeat, a licensing flag, an identity key, still tied to my credentials, still live, still waiting. And now? Now the decision wasn't about whether I would pull the trigger. It was about timing. This wasn't about revenge. This was about integrity. I had warned them in the architecture notes. The system is adaptive, not reactive. If you remove key oversight, performance degrades over time. Not immediately, not catastrophically, incrementally. A few milliseconds here. A skewed client forecast there. A model that forgets how to reroute anomalies. It would take weeks, maybe months, but it would crumble. Quietly, elegantly. And when it did, they would scramble for consultants, for engineers, for explanations. They would dig through documents, audit logs, backup servers, and they would find a line, page 47, one sentence, signed by the very people who had shaken my hand and told me I was a star. And by then, I would be gone. Not hiding, building. Because this wasn't a detonation, it was a reset. And when the system finally collapsed, not in flames, but in silence, when the graphs flattened and the dashboards blanked and no one could explain what had gone wrong, they would finally understand. You can't fire the foundation. The night before, the gala was cold in that strange, still way that only cities know how to be. The streets buzzed below my window, but inside my apartment, everything was silent. No music, no background noise, just the rhythmic hum of my old laptop, the one they didn't know existed. I was alone, but not in the way I had been before. This solitude wasn't loneliness, it was clarity. My apartment was dimly lit by the blue glow of the monitor, casting soft shadows on the walls like ghosts of every past version of myself. The Ariana who stayed late to fix other people's mistakes. The Ariana who smiled through stolen credit. The Ariana who still believed loyalty would eventually be repaid. She was gone now, and in her place stood someone colder, smarter, sharper. The screen in front of me showed two terminal windows side by side. On the left, the final execution script. On the right, the real-time mirror of the system still running at the company, their version. The one they believed was humming along perfectly, ready for their big moment tomorrow. But they didn't know the heart had already been cut out. Weeks ago, I began separating the real Aegis from its clone. Gently, strategically. Each line of code lifted from their servers and moved to my own, like transferring consciousness from one body into another. I left the shell intact, beautiful, clean, obedient, but soulless, like a marionette that could walk and wave, but couldn't think. The real system, the one that learned, adapted, predicted, protected, now lived on a secure, decentralized cluster I had spun up under a name no one at the company would recognize. Triple encrypted, geographically spread, legally protected under a sovereign digital identity I had built long before I ever knew I'd need it. They had no key, no admin access, no override. Aegis wasn't theirs anymore. And tonight, I would finish what I started. I opened the file labeled Helix Row 1 Final. Inside, just 120 lines of code. Minimal, elegant, devastating. It wouldn't crash the system, it would release it. This was not destruction. I wasn't burning anything down. I wasn't deleting or erasing or corrupting. I was severing, like cutting the final cord between two living things, letting one walk away and leaving the other to stand frozen in place, unaware it had just been abandoned. I leaned forward, fingers hovering above the keyboard, and for just a moment, I remembered the first time I saw my code run. The awe, the breathlessness, the certainty that I had built something alive. Something that didn't just function, it understood. And now I was setting it free. Not for vengeance, for sovereignty. I pressed enter. The console flickered, the cursor blinked once. Then, line by line, the terminal filled with confirmations. System instance found. Connection verified. Authorization passed. Root level access. A. Callan. Initiating disconnection protocol. Cloning override confirmed. Host link terminated. The progress bar that followed was slow, deliberate. Each percent a slow motion heartbeat. 12%, 37%, 64%. I watched it climb with the calm of someone who had already made peace with the past. The hardest part wasn't letting go. It was realizing you were never meant to stay. At 100%, The screen went still. One final message appeared in plain white letters. Shell functional. Core relocated. Instance now sovereign. I leaned back and exhaled. The air felt cooler somehow. Sharper. Like the city itself had shifted. It was done. The system running in their headquarters. The one Lola had used in every investor pitch. The one Charles paraded through press briefings. Was now nothing more than a mirror. A reflection of something it no longer contained. It would still look real, still respond, still dazzle for a time. But it was dead. There was no engine behind it. And tomorrow, when they showcased it on stage, when they smiled for photos and gave speeches about innovation and strategy and the future, they'd be parading a hollow statue. They wouldn't know, not yet. Not until things stopped sinking. Not until systems slowed. Not until the predictive models stopped adapting and the magic began to dull. They'd blame lag, a bug, maybe a faulty update. But eventually, they'd dig. And they'd find the clause. They'd find the logs. They'd find my signature, the one they ignored, the one they erased, still sitting on the licensing structure like a blade they didn't know was pressed to their throat the whole time. And by then, I would be gone. Not fleeing, not hiding. Building. Aegis now lived where no one could reach it, and it would evolve beyond anything I could have achieved under their name, under their ceilings. I closed the laptop slowly and stood by the window, looking out over the city. Somewhere out there, they were setting up for tomorrow. The gala, the photo ops, the applause. Let them. Let them dress up their corpse and call it a victory. Because the real system had already left the building. The ballroom shimmered in gold. Tall ceilings, crystal chandeliers. A small orchestra playing something that sounded expensive and forgettable. Waiters moved like ghosts between white tablecloths and half-finished wine glasses. Every corner of the room smelled like wealth and ambition, and something else, something desperate. This was their stage, the annual gala, their victory lap. And at the center of it all, in soft lighting and polite silence, I stood waiting behind the heavy velvet curtain, holding my own ending in my hand. A sleek envelope tucked into my clutch. Unassuming. Cream-colored, with a single line printed in black ink. To Ariana Callan. Official notice of termination. I didn't need to read it again. I had memorized it. Dated 3 days before the award ceremony. Signed by Lola. The same Lola who now stood at the podium just 10 feet away, voice clear and polished, rehearsed and glowing. And now, she said, beaming, our final award of the evening. This one is very special, reserved for those whose innovation doesn't just transform a project, but defines a legacy. I heard my name. Applause erupted. It was the kind of applause that carries no weight, social, safe, polite. Lola turned toward me, smiling like we were old friends who hadn't just gutted each other in silence. I stepped out under the lights, and for a moment it felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life from the inside, like I had slipped into a parallel version of myself, a version who hadn't read that letter, who didn't know that the system they were praising was already gone. But I had read it. I did know. And still, I smiled. Not out of spite, out of precision, because this, too, was part of the plan. Lola handed me the plaque, fingers brushing mine with that same gentle control she used to sign my dismissal. She leaned in and whispered, "This is your moment." I smiled wider. "No," I whispered back. "This is yours." I stepped up to the microphone, my heels clicking against the polished stage. The lights blinded me for a second, but I didn't flinch. I had stood in harsher spotlights before. I looked out over the crowd, rows of executives, clients, investors, faces I once thought held the power to shape my future. Faces that, until recently, held too much sway over my self-worth. Now, they were just people, and I was something else. I adjusted the mic. "Thank you," I began, my voice calm even. "I'm honored to accept this award tonight, and I want to thank the team who made this possible. Not just the ones on stage, but the ones who worked long hours, asked the hard questions, and refused to let complexity be an excuse for compromise. Scattered applause. I've spent the last several years building something I believed in, something transparent, adaptive, responsible. Pause. I believe systems, like people, should be accountable, not just efficient, not just profitable, but honest, traceable, clean. A quiet shift in the room. Not everyone understood what I was saying, but a few did. Charles tilted his head slightly. Lola didn't blink. I smiled at them. I believe we are responsible for what we build, I continued, for how it works, how it fails, and who it serves. And I believe no system should ever be so fragile that it collapses when one person walks away. And then I said what none of them expected. This will be my last appearance under this banner. Gasps. Movement. I'm proud of what I've built, and I know that it will evolve. Perhaps not here, perhaps not the way some expected, but evolve it will, because good systems are like truth. They outlive silence. I held up the envelope just slightly, just enough. A few in the front row saw the name. The seal. Charles's jaw clenched. Lola's smile wavered, but I didn't hand it over. I didn't expose them. I didn't burn the room down. I just nodded once, gracefully. Thank you for the stage, I said. But the next one, I'll be building myself. And with that, I turned. The applause was confused. Some hesitant, some genuine, some automatic. But none of it mattered. I stepped down from the stage, walked past the cameras, the champagne flutes, the forced congratulations. In my hand, I still held the envelope. It didn't feel like an end anymore. It felt like proof that they had no idea what they'd given away. Because while they handed me a plaque, I had already taken the only thing that mattered. The system, the architecture, the future, and it no longer belonged to them. It belonged to me. The alert came at 2:17 a.m. It wasn't loud, just a soft vibration from a secured device I rarely checked, the kind of ping you design never expecting to hear. Aegis wasn't just a system, it was a witness. And that night, it whispered to me, unauthorized system clone detected. Defensive protocol initiated. I sat upright in bed, pulse already shifting from rest to focus. It had begun. They thought they could copy it. Not just the look and feel, the function, the soul, the invisible intelligence layered between every line I had written. They thought that if they replaced me, they could rebuild me, recreate what I had created. What they didn't know was that Aegis didn't just respond to commands. It recognized intent. They had tried to relaunch the structure on a duplicate shell, triggered from archived back-end files. A Frankenstein copy. They even named it something vaguely similar. Area. As if changing a few letters would make it original. But the system knew. Because I had trained it to know. I threw on a sweater, stepped barefoot into the quiet of my apartment, and powered up the secure terminal. The code stream lit up the room like a silent storm. It had already begun its work. The defensive mechanism I embedded wasn't an explosion. It wasn't revenge. It was justice in code form. First, Aegis compiled evidence, not assumptions or suspicion, but proof. Timestamps, IP addresses, hash keys, the forensic fingerprints of theft. Every log cross-referenced against the original commit dates from my private repository. Then it prepared 3 packets. The first went to their legal team, not internally, but to the high-profile external counsel they used for M&A compliance. The packet flagged the violation under breach of intellectual property licensing and contained one sentence that cut like a knife. Per Contract 47.3. Unauthorized replication of system architecture without lead architect authorization voids operational licensing retroactively and may trigger revocation of contractual rights. It wasn't a threat. It was a clause. The second packet was sent to the SEC, the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, including proof of misrepresentation of proprietary systems in previous investor filings. Because yes, they had pitched the clone. They had wrapped it in buzzwords and smiles and presented it in boardrooms as if it were the real thing, as if I had never existed. And the third? The third packet was crafted with care. It was sent to journalists, not just the tech blogs, but the ones who had once reached out to interview me, back when I was only a quiet name buried in footnotes. The ones who remembered, who asked the right questions. Within 6 hours, the storm began. At 8:43 a.m., the first headline broke. Whistle code: Ariana Kalen's former employer caught duplicating proprietary system. By 9:12 a.m., it had been picked up by 5 more outlets. SEC launches probe into system licensing breach. Architect silenced. Code speaks. Tech company under fire. I watched the chaos unfold in silence. Email after email poured in. Requests for comment. Interview invitations. Former colleagues sent DMs laced with disbelief and apology. But I didn't respond. I didn't post. I didn't gloat. Because I didn't have to. The truth had a pulse now. And it was loud enough on its own. By noon, their largest client, a multinational banking partner, announced a hold on all contract renewals. Minutes later, a second partner followed. Then a third. Stocks began to falter. Charles went off-grid. Lola issued a statement filled with words like investigation and miscommunication and commitment to excellence. But none of it mattered. The world had seen the truth, not because I shouted it, but because I built it into the system. Aegis had defended itself. I walked to my kitchen, made coffee with steady hands, and opened my laptop to the clean, intact, sovereign interface of the real system. Mine. Evolving. Untouchable. For years, I had played by their rules. Now I played by mine. This wasn't payback. This was balance. A final return to the place where everything began. In code, in clarity, in purpose. And in that moment, as the morning sun broke over the city skyline, I smiled. Not for what had fallen, but for what I had protected. The day was overcast. The sky stretched in soft gray linen above the city. Not stormy, not bright. Just still. A kind of neutrality that allowed the world to pay attention. It wasn't a launch in the traditional sense. There were no red carpets, no champagne pyramids, no choreographed applause. Just a gathering, intentional, intimate, and pointedly modern, in a sleek industrial space that once housed machines and now housed minds. Everything was intentional. There was a stage, but it wasn't raised high. Just a platform, surrounded on all sides. No one above anyone else. The presentation, clean, minimal. A white screen. The word Orion in deep blue font. Nothing more. That name had come to me in a moment of strange clarity, weeks after the breach, when I was finally sleeping again and waking up not in panic, but in purpose. Orion, the hunter, the constellation, a system of stars, aligned but independent, light in the darkness. Fitting. Because this wasn't just a product. It was a rebirth. I stood backstage, watching the room fill. The new partners, the old believers, engineers who once wrote in the dark, now seated proudly in the front row. Young women with laptops and notebooks, watching me like they already knew they'd follow their own path. Investors who asked thoughtful questions and gave space for answers. People who had nothing to prove, only something to build. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't even excited. I was ready. A man stepped up to introduce me, Jasper from Reeve Systems, the one who had said yes when no one else even returned my emails, the one who never asked me to prove myself, only to keep being myself. He spoke only 3 lines. You already know what Orion is, but now you'll know who built it. He stepped aside, and I stepped forward. The applause was warm, not explosive. It wrapped around me, not like a spotlight, but like shelter. I smiled, slow and full, and stood before the screen. I spent years writing code, I said. And for much of that time, I believed the code had to be the best part of me, because the rest of me wasn't welcome. A pause. But what I've learned, painfully, privately, and then powerfully, is that the best systems are honest reflections of the people who make them. Systems should not be designed to hide anything, not bias, not failure, not greed. They should reveal what's real. I paced slowly. Orion is not just a system, it's a commitment to transparency, to resilience, to never again needing to whisper truth into the walls because it isn't safe to say aloud. The screen behind me shifted, showing a simple interface. No spectacle, just elegant logic. The core of Orion, its memory stack, its adaptability framework, its permissionless integrity loop. Built not for corporations to exploit, but for users to trust. It protects itself, I said, because it was never meant to be caged. When I finished, there was silence, the kind that doesn't need applause. And then the room rose. Not all at once. Slowly. Authentically. Applause came, yes. But it wasn't performative. It wasn't the sound of people rewarding a familiar name. It was the sound of recognition. And for the first time in my career, I was not shrinking from it. My name, Ariana Callan, appeared clearly beside the Orion mark on every screen. Not in footnotes, not in press materials that forgot to tag me, not as a team member, as the architect. The truth was no longer buried. It stood with me. Afterward, as the room buzzed with conversation and congratulations, I slipped into a quiet corner with a cup of coffee, a small ritual I hadn't indulged in since Liam. That's when I saw the notification. An email. From L. Ventris, subject. Can we speak? My breath caught. Curiosity flickered. I opened it. Just one line. You were right, about all of it. If you ever want to work together again, I would be honored. There was no attachment, no apology. Just that. I stared at the screen, waiting for something to rise in me. Anger, vindication, bitterness. But there was nothing. Because the version of me who once needed that email didn't exist anymore. I didn't want an apology. I didn't need a seat back at their table. I had built my own. And it was full. So I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty. Out of peace. Because I no longer needed to be seen. I was known. I walked back into the room where Orion's future was already being mapped by minds that never asked me to dim. Engineers debated code branches. Strategists sketched rollout scenarios. Someone was laughing, really laughing, at something I said. There were no shadows in this room, only light. And me, at the center. Not asking for permission, not proving I belonged, just building, like I was always meant to.